So in a team of coaches and support staff, everyone is wearing his own hat. And sometimes there is disagreement.
Yes.
So how do you deal, you specifically, Matt Little, as an S&C coach, how do you deal if this disagreement comes up between different disciplines?
Yeah, it's a great question, that. It's a great question. I think a lot of it depends on how good a bond there is between the team and how much trust there is between the team. Because I think that's the first thing you need to work on in any team, obviously, is trusting each other, trusting each other's expertise, and being aware when you are crossing over with each other. And respecting each other, I think, is very difficult if you don't have a connection first. If you don't all get on as a team. Now, you don't all have to be best friends, but I believe there has to be respect there, obviously. If you all respect each other in the very first place, then those conversations and disagreements are very easy to have. They're very easy to have. But if there is a break in the team, if there are two people that don't like each other, therefore don't respect each other's opinions, then that's when the problems come. So I think managing these disagreements and these issues with teams starts long before that discussion first happens. And that actually teams have got to put a lot of work in and a lot of effort into connecting and forming trust and building trust with each other first. And in my experience, the only way to do that is to forcibly spend time with each other. So one of the areas that I see that doesn't happen very often is the strength and conditioning coach going into the tennis coach's environment and standing on the court, watching the tennis session, having discussions with the coach, listening to the coach, and just being in their environment. And then inviting the tennis coach into the gym to be in the strength and conditioning coach's environment. When you forcibly spend time together, you create a bond, you build a bond, then you build trust, and then it's very easy to have those discussions where there may be disagreements. If you never go on the tennis court and listen to the tennis coach, and the coach never comes into the gym and listens to you in your environment, then when you have a disagreement as a team, the only way that's going is it's going to blow up. Because people don't have that bond and that trust. So everyone is defending themselves in that situation. They're not open to feedback.
Yeah.
So I think the hard work of all of those meetings is done months and months beforehand, if you have the time, in the building of relationships first.
Yeah. And you have worked alongside many high-profile coaches now. What do you think are the similarities between them, and what were the biggest challenges for you over the years?
I think they've all been very different in their styles. Some have been more autocratic and dictatorial in their styles, and others have been more democratic in their styles. Some are prepared to listen and ask questions, and others would rather tell you their views. And therefore, you have to spend more time with those coaches, again, doing listening, doing what they're asking you to do so that you build trust. You have to set aside a period of time where you are going to build that relationship with that coach and accept the fact that you're not going to get everything you want in those first few months while you're building trust. Then once you've hopefully established that relationship, you can manage them from below. You can make suggestions to them that then perhaps in 2 or 3 months' time, they might come up with that as an idea, and they will then think that it's their idea, if that makes sense.
It does
That's
make a
for
lot of
me
sense.
the way to work with a coach that has a very strong views on things, is you have to take a long-term approach to building a trust and connection and a relationship with that coach. and then start to suggest things, ideas, and then just walk away and leave them to think about that idea. The one thing you're never going to be able to do with a coach who's like that is to tell them what they are going to be doing, tell them what you are going to be doing, and that's that. That's never, ever going to work. And so some people would take that approach, and that's fine. That may be their personalities, but they can't expect to last long in that job or to have a successful outcome. So what you need to do is be pragmatic and think, well, what's the best way for me to get a successful outcome? It's probably doing a couple of months worth of exercises that I don't necessarily believe in order to build trust and change the program over time. I'm going to have a better result there than if I try and smash through my program right now at the start, and things probably blow up and the relationship fail and probably be out of the door quite quickly. Yeah. I think if you are already the incumbent strength and conditioning coach and a new coach starts, I think that's a very important first conversation, and Jez Green was fantastic at doing this. Whenever a new coach would begin, Jez would go and have a coffee with that coach and talk to them about the plan that was currently in place for the physical side of the program. He would say, look, this is what we are doing. This is what we've been doing for years. And this is what we are now doing with the strength and conditioning program. This is the plan. This is the direction we're taking this program in. If you have some ideas about how you can contribute to that program, that's great. I'd love to listen to that. But what we really don't want to do at this stage is rip the program up and start again with whatever your ideas are. I think you're able to have that conversation if you are in post when someone new comes in. But I think if you're starting a new job and you have no training history with that person or that team, and there are coaches already in place, like I say, I think you're going to have to swallow a good few months of doing perhaps other exercises or other people's exercises first while you build that trust and that relationship, in my opinion.
That's a very good answer. I think that's very valuable. Talking about coaches, of course, no discussion is complete. Talking about Ivan Lendl, from the outside, it appears he has brought the biggest change. What I'm interested in, because you have been there before the Lendl coaching time and after.
Yeah. I mean, Ivan is well, obviously a legend of the game. You know, it goes without saying. Everybody knows who he is and what he has done, and you know, there aren't words to put into, you know, how much you would respect him as a player that he has been. What he brought to the table in terms of his coaching was that same mentality of winning. You know, almost a brutal mentality of winning in many respects. And only someone who is as successful as Ivan has been could bring a mentality as brutal as he does, in terms of, he'd be saying, look, go out there and enjoy torturing this player today. Don't just beat them, but torture them in the process. Now, if I'm standing there saying that to Andy, that carries absolutely no weight whatsoever. But with Ivan Lendl standing there saying that to Andy or a player, that is incredibly impactful for that player's performance. And that's what he brings to the table. So for me, the best moments of working with Ivan were those little chats that he would have with Andy before he'd go out for matches. And you're thinking, wow, someone as successful as Ivan Lendl saying those words can break through any barrier, in my opinion, you know, because he is who he is. Yeah. Even someone not quite as successful, still successful, but not quite as successful as Ivan saying those words, it still isn't as impactful as someone like Ivan saying it, if that makes sense. Yeah. So that was one side of it. He was fiercely loyal to everybody in the team. No matter what was happening, he would always defend the team with Andy. He would be sitting down with Andy saying, listen, you've really got to respect these guys, these coaches. and the physical trainers and the physio. And not that Andy ever disrespected us, but he would always be backing us in our opinions and what needed to be done. Even if he didn't agree with it, he'd be speaking to us privately about that. But actually, to Andy and to the media, he was fiercely loyal. And I'll never, ever forget that. And I will always appreciate that, again, from someone like him who's been as successful as he has been. I found that quite astonishing. I thought he'd be more cutthroat and brutal about that aspect of life. And actually, he was incredibly impressive in that aspect as well. Obviously, his expertise in tennis and the things he would be working on with Andy were all fantastic. His knowledge of the game was incredible. But those were the things that, from my perspective, impacted me the most as part of the support team, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Interesting. How do you design a training program? Just take us through your thought process.
Yeah, I mean, that has changed a lot, and I probably alluded to it a little bit earlier in terms of I'm now looking at the sessions that the player is doing on the court, and what the coach is trying to achieve in those sessions almost before I write my physical program, because so often in the past I've had my plan for the physical program of strength work and power work and speed work and all those things, only for it to be kind of completely negated by the player walking into the gym having just done a 3.5-4 hour tennis session and they can barely walk. So for me, it almost starts with the on-court program of what the coach is trying to achieve, and then trying to have an influence on that and saying, well, okay, if the player needs to move better, how are we going to structure the week so that the week is really conducive to that happening? When are we going to do the movement work and the speed work? When are we going to do the explosive work in the gym that's going to help with that? And kind of starting that way round in many respects. So that would be my start point. I mean, if I was starting with a younger player, whatever, then, the usual aspects of their training history and their stage in growth and maturation and their goals, their playing style, their testing results, all of those things would play a part. But now my training programs are written probably more pragmatically and more practically around, well, what's actually going to happen on the court this week and the next few weeks? What are we really trying to improve? And that's usually can only be one thing at a time, maybe two things to try and improve at any one time. And I think that's one of the mistakes we make often in our jobs, is we're trying to improve so many things at once, when in reality we can probably only genuinely influence one or two physical characteristics at once. Unless you're working with someone who's in poor shape or poor condition, okay, then I'm sure there's other things, that there are many things that can improve at once. But actually, yeah, it's kind of focus on one thing and then try and get the week structured so that we can actually genuinely get improvements in that one thing based on all of the technical and tactical training they're doing as well. It's pretty simplistic answer, I suppose, and not going into the technicalities of what lifts. But to be perfectly honest, Christian, I think you'd be quite, well, maybe you wouldn't be surprised, but some of the people listening would be surprised at how simple Andy's training program often is. Because for me, we very rarely get away from those meat and potatoes lifts and exercises, because tennis players generally rarely get so strong that you can forget about that stuff. They don't do enough off-court work that you can kind of say, okay, you don't need to deadlift anymore and you don't need to squat or lunge anymore. You can move on to more advanced things because they're not strong enough to move on to more advanced things, and they never get strong enough to move on to more advanced things, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And there's a quote, simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. So I think that fits very well here.
I like that one. I like that. I didn't know that one.
I know you have started working with monitoring training load. You use GPS units and also
Yes,
the match analysis to optimize the strength and conditioning. Can you just talk us
yes.
through what you did?
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of obsessed with GPS, and I think that tennis is way behind the curve as a sport in wearable technology. Soccer and rugby and field sports have been using this stuff for decades now. Tennis is hardly see it at all. And I think especially in terms of player load, where I think the tennis players massively overdo the player load in comparison to the load that they would achieve in matches. In a weekly practice, I think they could do up to double the player load that they would experience in matches throughout the training week. And so I think that's a massive thing that needs to change in our industry in tennis, is that monitoring player load, whatever your technology is that you use, there has to be a measure of load, and that needs to be applied to matches and practice, and then see the difference, measure the difference, because in tennis, I think we overload players way too much on the court. But you can't have that conversation until you've got some metrics.
Mm.
And so in tennis, we usually prescribe sessions by minutes, which is useless, because 1 hour of really difficult physical work will be completely different to 1 hour of light technical work. And so I believe that really in tennis we do a bad job of that. And the thing is, I know that GPS units aren't necessarily, as accurate as they could be, and so on and so forth. But to me, that doesn't matter, because you're comparing, usually with tennis, you're comparing them with an N of one. You're working with one player using the same unit day in, day out. You still get noticeable measurements and things that you can rely on and compare one day to the other. And essentially, you're just asking yourself, is one day harder than the next? Now, the technology is there and are readily available now. And we need to start programming and planning weeks based on objective markers like player load, and stop doing it on minutes, because minutes is a useless metric, in my opinion, in tennis. It doesn't mean to say everyone needs to rush out and buy a GPS unit, but you can even just categorize your training into difficult aspects of the training, light technical aspects of the training, and just blocking sessions into how much time you spend doing difficult stuff versus how much time you spend doing easy stuff. Even that in itself is a good way to start. And I just think, like I say, I don't think we do that well enough in our sport. And I think that lots and lots of players down the years have suffered as a result of that situation. And I think that's not acceptable anymore, because we know better than that now. We also use the Hawkeye data in matches, because Hawkeye, the camera-based system we have in tennis, can also track the player as well as the ball. And therefore, we're starting to try and figure out player loads from matches as well, and trying to figure out the demands, the real genuine demands of a match versus what we thought it was 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. So, I think with the wearable technology and with the use of camera-based technology, I think there's not much we're not going to know about the performance pretty soon. I think it's pretty exciting. It makes our jobs infinitely more easy, because we can actually train what needs to be trained rather than what we thought needed to be trained. Let's take speed, for example. I did an article on LinkedIn about the need for speed in tennis. I don't think we need max speed very often in tennis. And GPS confirms that. You spend very, very few meters in terms of the amount of meters you would use on a court, very few meters being at max speed. So therefore, how often do we need to train that off the court? Whereas actually in terms of acceleration and deceleration, we do hundreds and hundreds of those in a match. Could be up to potentially 800 of those in a match. Therefore, how much acceleration and deceleration training are we doing versus max speed? Would be one example I'd give.
Yeah. And I know you're very passionate about training blocks and implementing training periods for professional tennis players where they have time to improve physically. Just a rough outline. How do you do that?
Well, like I say, but when they compete all year round, you have to force them to take a training block. You have to force them to put their rackets down and prioritize the physical work. So it's really sitting down with the coach and the player and saying, right, what part of the year are you going to say is not a priority for you on the court? Because like I say, they could pick any time of the year, they could pick a whole bunch of tournaments to play. So it's making sure you sit down with the player at the start of the year and figuring out, I would say, a 4 to 6 week period in that year where they're not going to play tournaments. Then also trying to pick out 2 or 3 week blocks, maybe twice more in the year, again, where the physical development is going to take priority. Because if you don't do that at the start of the year, you certainly won't be doing it halfway through the year. And the other message to say to players is that just doing this once for 1 year is not going to get you the benefits that you want. You need to be doing this for 3, 4, 5, 6 years of physical training blocks to get you to where you want to be, which is a tennis playing athlete that can put up with the rigors of the senior tour in either men's or women's tennis. So, yeah, you've got to be organised with that. You've got to make sure that you get there in plenty of time before the block to make sure these things are planned in and that time is set aside in the year. So if my advice to coaches would be is, when do you think your player should do the block? When do you think is your player's least priority time of the year on the court? And start pushing for that as soon as possible and as far away from that block as possible so that you get that written in stone and committed to, and then you get a chance to get your hands on the player without the fatigue of matches and without the fatigue of on-court work. And then you can get some genuine gains and make some leaps with that player in their off-court training. Because I feel like without doing that, without setting that time aside, it's virtually impossible to get the gains that they require to play at the top level, in my opinion.
Yeah. And then I'm pretty sure you have heard that question before. I just want to hear your opinion. Probably people will say, well, it's very relatively easy if you have a top 10 or top 5 player to do that, because you can pick the Masters, you can pick the Slams and the ATP 1000s. So what would you recommend for a player who's top 50, top 100, something like that, where planning has to be, well, whether it really has to be, we don't know, but where it has to be a little bit more flexible and depends on this week I had a bad week, let's go for another 2 tournaments instead of resting. What's your point on? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I just think that they've got to bite the bullet. I think they've got to just say, look, there's a time of the year where I'm going to need to recover and then train. And even though I know that these players, obviously, you know, their income is based on playing week in, week out, they have to just commit to that process and trust that process of physical development. You know, I've worked with lower ranked players who have been saying to me whilst we've been doing blocks, yeah, I could be out there earning money and competing right now. And the answer has to be, well, yeah, you know, obviously what the hope is, there's no guarantee, but what we're hoping here is that by making physical leaps, you're going to be winning those tournaments soon, and you're going to be making leaps in your ranking so that practice planning is going to be easier for you one day. But the only way to get there from a physical perspective, not necessarily your game, but from a physical perspective, is to commit to those blocks and take that time out of the competitive schedule to make those leaps. You will not make physical leaps without doing those blocks. So I think for those guys and girls, they just have to just find a time of the year. Like you say, there's futures on every week. So just pick a time in the year when they're least likely to want to compete and commit to taking out, let's say 4 weeks. Doesn't have to be 6. Take out 4 weeks and work physically. But the other aspect that they need to know is that probably the first week or two, the first tournament or two after that training block, they might not feel great in terms of their on-court, the way they're playing, potentially even the way they're feeling, depending on what you've worked on. If you've worked on, you know, cardiovascular conditioning in that block and they've done lots of that kind of work, they might not be feeling fantastic in their first tournament back. But what they will get is benefits from that block throughout the next, 4 months, 5, 6 months from that work. Like I talked about when Andy made world number one, it was the physical blocks that he'd done just before that carried him through those months.
Yeah.
And so I passionately believe that getting that work done will pay dividends for them in the end. But if they think they're going to do 1 4-week block and then go on their best run ever, well, I hope they do. But I think in reality, it's years and years of doing 4-week blocks, which is going to get them to where they want to be. I'm sure Jez, now working with Alex Zverev, is doing exactly that. And that those blocks that he's putting in now are definitely going to pay off in the course of time.
How does a day in the life of an S&C coach for professional tennis players look like? Just take us through morning to evening. What do you do?
Yeah, it's long. It's long, that's for sure. As you well know. So, I mean, Andy's, let's say a typical day for Andy, because his day is my day. I'm there for all of it, other than commercial stuff. We will meet typically 2 hours before practice. There'll be an hour with the physio and an hour with me. So yeah, he does 2 hours before he even steps on court, and that is stuff on the couch, with various treatment and an activation on the couch, and then there's a whole process of getting him warm, and then getting him activated with me, and we take plenty of time doing that. You don't necessarily need 2 hours. That sounds like a long time, but we don't rush it. There's always stuff that gets talked about. So you need to allow wriggle room in these sessions. If I allow just 30 minutes for a warm-up, there's not much wriggle room there. So yeah, anyway, 2 hours. We meet 2 hours before practice. His practice will be anything but from an hour to 3 hours, and that's pretty typical for a tour level player. So that's that. Then there's generally some food for an hour or so, and then the strength and conditioning program. We'll do that in the afternoon. That's another, let's say, between an hour and 2 hours. I'm almost never in the gym with him much longer than an hour to 75 minutes, frankly. I think that you get diminishing returns. I'm sure many people would have experienced that the quality drops much after that. So that's his physical program. And then it's the recovery with the physio after that. And again, I'm there for that, because I could very easily say at the end of the gym session, right, great, I'm off, done. But the conversations that happen on that physio couch for the last hour of treatment of the day could be a really important coaching moment for me. And that's why you never want to miss any of the conversations. And that's why I think the S&C coach should be on the court too, because you never know when that door is going to open for you to say, yeah, we need to take a 6-week block to improve that situation, do less on-court work this week, and let's focus more on this. Can come out of nowhere when they could be speaking to the most innocuous random person, even a fan or something like that. It's important to be around all the time, in my view. Dual question, so the next, wants a job, traveling around lots of cities, nice places in the world. And look, there are far worse professions in this world in terms of the glamour and things. I'm very lucky to do what I do, and I love what I do. But as you know, Christian, it's generally a hotel room, a gym, and a tennis court. And that's, I'm going to say, in my 11 years traveling with Andy, I've seen probably 2 tourist attractions. I went to the Great Wall of China for about half an hour, and I went to the Eiffel Tower for about 20 minutes. And that's pretty much it in 11 years. So don't expect to be seeing a lot of the world other than hotels and tennis courts.
It's still working. It's not tourism, isn't it?
Exactly. The number of people who I know that don't work in this job that say to me, oh, you're going to Miami. Oh, fantastic. Wow. And I'm like, do you know what? That's one of the most difficult 3 weeks of the year, because we're brutalizing him physically. He's brutalizing us mentally, and it's just one great big fight for a few months in Miami. So it's not this chilling on the beach vibe at all.
Okay, almost at the end. Which person has influenced and impacted you most, and why?
It's definitely Andy. He's even influenced my coaching. His demand every day for answers about what he's doing and why he's doing it. His demand for high standards, both in the sessions I give to him, but also in how I am and how I behave and how I manage my own life, are huge. His commitment to excellence in his own life have made me commit to excellence in my own. And so those things, I think, are lessons. And being around him, not even talking to him about this stuff, but just letting his behaviors absorb into my own, have been lessons for life, which I hope I carry on for many, many years after I finish working with him. And I hope I don't lose those lessons and forget those things, because, yeah, I think that it's been incredibly valuable.
Cool. Do you want to nominate someone to be interviewed?
I think Speedo would be a great guy to interview. I think Jez Green would be a great guy to interview as well. I think Bill is fantastic as well. He's a fantastic speaker. So those three guys get my nod for the guys you should be speaking to next. Jill Myberg as well, to add a girl into the mix, because we don't talk about girls in our profession enough in terms of practitioners. She does a fantastic job.
Cool. And you said you're writing a book. When is it going to come out?
That's a great question. I'm still searching for a publisher. I thought I had one and then didn't. So, I'm hoping that it'll come out perhaps spring or autumn next year. So, got plenty of work to still be done.
Really cool. Where can people find you, Matt?
I am on Twitter, Matt Little S&C on Twitter. But I don't do much social media. I should do a lot more, and I don't do much social media. I'm on LinkedIn as well. So Twitter and LinkedIn, I'm sure I'll be easy enough to find in those two mediums. But I need to be better at that. This is the modern world, and I need to get on board with it.
Okay. Hey, Matt, thanks so much for your time, for the open words.
Pleasure.
It was
My
great.
Pleasure. Guarantee that anytime, Christian. For you, mate, you're a high-level guy, and it's a pleasure to do it for you. So I wish you all the best with the work you're doing.
Thanks a lot, Matt.
You're welcome anytime, mate.